I hereby open this academic ceremony in which Ibrahim Hashim will defend his academic thesis, Deep in Predictions, Unravelling Visual Perception with Deep Neural Networks, inspired by hierarchical predictive coding. May I invite you to present a summary of your thesis and conclusions of your work.
Thank you very much. Dear Prorector, dear Corona, dear family, dear friends, thank you for joining me today while I defend my PhD thesis, entitled Deep in Predictions. I'd like to begin by looking at the subtitle of my thesis, which is a short statement which, in my opinion, encompasses very well the work that I conducted in the last 4 years. The subtitle is Unravelling Visual Perception with Deep Neural Networks, inspired by hierarchical predictive coding. Now, for some of us in the room, this sentence might not yet make sense. So what I'd like to do is start by defining a few of the terms so that hopefully afterwards we'll all be able to enjoy the work that I conducted. So I'd like to start by defining visual perception. Now, visual perception is a crucial function of the brain that enables us to understand and interact with our environment, so the external world around us, based on a number of different visual factors. So these visual factors encompass things such as shape, size, color, spatial proximity, and speed, among others. And our ability of our brain to identify and recognize these different factors and make them have sense or give them meaning allows us to then interact and succeed in our environment. So you can imagine this picture that I have here represents berries inside a forest. And our brain allows us to identify the different kinds of berries based on their color and their size. And it might allow us to interpret which kind of berries are poisonous and which ones are edible. It might also allow us to recognize if there's a threat in front of the berries, not allowing us to get there. So the visual perception as a higher cognitive function is very vital for our existence. Now, how exactly the brain can achieve visual perception is a matter that is debated among neuroscientists. There's different neuroscientific theories of how we could achieve visual perception. One theory is hierarchical predictive coding. So hierarchical predictive coding is a neuroscientific theory that can explain or attempts to explain how the brain could achieve visual perception. Now, the way that hierarchical predictive coding proposes that we perceive is by making or by containing within our brain an internal model of the external world. With this internal model, we can then make predictions of what we should see. We can compare these predictions, which we attempt to make, or the brain attempts to make as accurate as possible, to what is actually out there in the real world. So what you can imagine these predictions to be are a form of hallucinations, but they're controlled by the actual outside world, which is information that enters our eyes. Now, just to make this a bit more structured or a bit more clear, the visual system is a hierarchical system. It has different visual areas. Each visual area, you can imagine, is a small piece of cortical tissue, so a small piece of brain tissue, that contains within it a number of neurons. The lowest level visual areas are neurons that are connected directly to the eyes, so they receive information from the eyes. These neurons in this visual area then connect to neurons in a higher level area, so in other neurons that are more distally related to the information present in the eyes. And that's how the hierarchy appears. And you have connections between the groups of neurons. So you have feed-forward connections from lower to higher areas, and you have feedback connections from higher to lower level areas. Now what predictive coding postulates is that the information being carried in the feedback connections, so higher to lower level areas, are the predictions. The predictions of what the external world is showing us through our eyes. In the feed-forward direction, predictive coding postulates the brain measures error. So what occurs is the predictions we make are compared to the targets. The targets are what is entering our eyes and entering, therefore, our brains. These are compared to each other, and the difference, the error, is fed back up the hierarchy to allow the visual system to rectify what its predictions were, to improve upon them, and to learn more about the external world we live in. Now I'd like to make this a bit more pictorial for you. So what you could have is this flower inside a pot with a leaf. And this is what our eyes are seeing, and this information is sent to the lower part of our visual cortex, so the lowest level visual area. And it is compared to the prediction. In this case, the prediction could be a flower inside a pot. Now this target, which is the flower inside the pot with the leaf, and the prediction, the flower inside the pot, are compared. And the difference, the error, the leaf in this case, is sent back up the hierarchy so that the network, or the brain in this case, can adjust its prediction. So that's hierarchical predictive coding in a nutshell. Now the final word I still want to define are deep neural networks. Now deep neural networks are a mathematical technique which allow us, in essence, to build artificial versions of the brain, or of parts of the brain. This is how you can imagine it. The nice thing with deep neural networks is that you can also impart principles from different neuroscientific theories into these structures. So for example, we could take predictive coding. The idea is that error should be measured and that prediction should be measured, and we can use this and build this into our artificial version of the visual cortex. And then we can have this network and we can make tests on it as if we're testing the brain. And we can see how similar are the results that we get from this network to how similar from results we get from the brain. And we can see, okay, is the theory actually explaining what the cortex does? And that's in the end actually what we did. We wanted to explore visual perception, this higher cognitive function. We wanted to do this out of the eyes of this theory, hierarchical predictive coding. And we did it by building these computational models using the methodology of deep neural networks. Now, why did we want to do this? It's a very good question. What was our interest in doing it? For that, I want to very shortly explain to you how neurons work. So neurons in the visual system, they see only a tiny part of the world as we see it. So when you and I look at this image of the flower, we see the entire flower with its leaf inside its pot. However, each individual neuron in the brain, in the visual system, will only see a tiny fragment of it. So each blue circle you can imagine as what a neuron would see. Now we integrate the information from all neurons, but each neuron only sees a small part. And the activity of neurons is based on what they see. So the top row neuron, circled in red, won't show any activity because there's no input to it. It's not seeing anything, and therefore it will not show any kind of activity. However, in the bottom row, the green neuron will show high activity because it has part of the pot, which we can call like a stimulus. It's an edge. This stimulus is covering the viewpoint or what the neuron can see, and this will cause this neuron to show high activity. So this is generally agreed upon by neuroscientists. Neurons in the visual system respond when they see something, and they don't respond if they don't see something. However, there's a very curious quirk in the visual system, because there are certain neurons that show a behavior that is unexpected. So if we look at this graph and we look at the 4 images at the bottom, it's just the area that a neuron can see, the same neuron, and we have a stimulus inside of it, this black line. And as you can see from left to right, this black line increases in length. But the actual information that the neuron sees hasn't changed. In each of the images, it sees exactly the same thing. However, curiously, and what you can see in this plot, is that the activity of the neuron decreases as this line increases in length. And this is a quirk, because why would a neuron that only should respond to information that's present within what it can see reduce its activity in response to the increase of a stimulus outside of its visual space? And predictive coding actually has a very simple explanation for this. Predictive coding argues that the neurons that show this behavior are error neurons. And the reason is that in our natural world, short lines do not occur very often. So it's very rare to see short lines. Because the brain, according to predictive coding, is learning about its external environment, it will learn that long lines are very typical, short lines are not. So if a short line is presented to the brain, then this will be less predictable. This reduction in predictability will increase the error. As the neurons are measuring error, because these are error neurons, they will show more activity. As the length of the line increases, the predictability increases, because it's more common to have longer lines. Therefore, there will be less error in these neurons, and therefore they will show less activity. So predictive coding can very simply explain this neurophenomenon, which has been a question mark for neuroscientists previously. So that's the reason we wanted to do this. We were very interested in this theory, and we wanted to build a computational model of this theory with which we could replicate these kind of results. And hopefully, once we have this computational model present, then we can give it to other researchers that can use it to make new predictions for future scientific research based on the field of predictive coding. So, how did we actually do this? Well, the first thing that we did is that we created a model that aligns with hierarchical predictive coding. So we designed a deep neural network, we took the principles of predictive coding, and we imparted these into the network. And then we trained this network to predict the next frame. So it would always predict the next frame in videos, and over time it would learn. Then what we had to do is, we weren't the only ones that had this idea. Many other researchers had a similar idea. They wanted to build a similar network to ours. Now, when we're looking at their networks, we felt that they were all missing something. We felt that we had a better approach than them. But, of course, you can't just say you did better than everyone else. You actually have to show that you outperformed the networks for the reasons that you wanted to build your network. So we took these competitor networks, we took our network, and we compared them to each other. Now, the first comparison that we did is we compared how good the networks were at predicting the next frame. So how good were the networks at understanding their external environment? And the way you can compare this is to compare the predictions your model makes with the actual information that should be predicted. The smaller the difference between the two, theoretically, the better the network is at understanding its external environment. So what you can see in this graph, in orange, on the left-hand side, are the competitor networks, and on the right-hand side is our model, in light blue. And what you can see, you want these bars to be as small as possible. And our bar is the shortest. So the difference between the predictions that our model makes and the actual information that's out in the world is the smallest compared to all the networks. Now, this was a first good cue that our network was achieving what we wanted to do. But our interest was not per se performance in terms of predicting the next frame. Our interest was to build a model that could follow the rules of hierarchical predictive coding and act as a model of this neuroscientific theory. So for this, we did a second test. What we did is, we basically defined many little tests, and we checked from each of the models how often do they fail to achieve this test. If they fail to achieve a test, so the more failures they have, the less likely they are to be a good model of hierarchical predictive coding. So again, in this graph, what you want is you want the bar to be as small as possible. And again, what you can see on the left-hand side are the competitor networks, and on the right-hand side is our model. And our model consistently behaved as expected by the theory. So not only was our network better at understanding its external environment, it did this while behaving as the theory expects compared to all competitor networks. So here we were already quite happy. And the last thing we wanted to test is, okay, can our network actually replicate these kind of effects that occur in the visual system? So as I mentioned earlier, there was this effect where neurons show reduction in activity in response to the length of a line increasing beyond their visual field. And in predictive coding, these are meant to be error neurons. So we tested this in our network. We had error neurons. We would show them these lines, and we test, okay, does the activity of the neuron decrease? And luckily, or maybe due to the work we conducted, our network's units responded like neurons do. So we were able to replicate exactly the results that we wanted to replicate. And of course, the work that we did was not only with this visual phenomenon. We replicated many different visual phenomena, and we are quite confident to say now that our model is in a good position, that we hope that other researchers in the field will take it and test if we'll make tests with it in terms of empirical research, using it as a baseline to compare with when they get the results from their empirical studies. Thank you very much for your attention, and I give the word back to the prorector.
Thank you very much for your presentation. And now we open the opposition with the chair of the assessment committee, Professor Dr. Federico De Martino, who is a chair for sensory circuits and neuroimaging here at Maastricht University at the Cognitive Neuroscience Department of FPN. Federico.
Yes, dear candidate, first of all, I would like to congratulate you and your supervisory team for a very beautiful thesis. It was a pleasure to read. I think that it's tough to find theses that actually really dive into one topic very, very deep. I like the fact that you did that. You stuck with an idea and you tested it as much as you could. I think this is a testament to believing in what you've done, and also in the idea of doing science in the right way. And I think this is really nice to see. I also would like to take the time to congratulate your family and friends and parents that have made it all the way here to see and to see your presentation and also witness this moment. Now, of course, as much as I liked it, I have to ask questions, and I am going to start with a question on the one chapter you didn't treat in your presentation. I am a lover of predictive coding, and I would like to have a lot of questions on the models, but there are better people in this corona than me for that. So I'm going to go back to my other love, which is fMRI. And in chapter 4, in figure 4.3, you present the results of your RSA analysis of different models on different visual areas. And when I look at this picture, the one thing it really jumps to my eye is how similar is the performance of all these models across the areas, independent of their hierarchical level. So just to make it clear, if you look at your PrediRep model trained with the all loss, in all areas you see that the performance is highest for the E1 and E2 layers, and then followed by E3, and then all the rest is more or less at the same place. And you made that as an eloquent description of how a model should be hierarchical because the brain is hierarchical. But to me, it seems your model is not so much hierarchical, because the hierarchical brain, which we know it is hierarchical, is explained always by the lowest level of your network. Not the lowest, because E0 is not doing that well, but let's say E1 is close to the lowest level. So I'm curious about what you think is happening. So why do you think it's the case that you don't see hierarchical representations aligning with the brain, but you see more or less somewhat this behavior, which, by the way, it's the same behavior also for the other networks, right? Also the other networks do the same. Yeah.
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you very much for your kind compliments and your question. So the reason that I believe that the first thing I would like to say is that I think it's a positive aspect that it was not only the old network, which is the loss that is kind of predictive coding inspired, that showed this behavior, but it's consistent across all of the different networks, so all of the different loss functions. Now, typically what you find if you look at RSA research, for example, with classification losses, is that you would also see, it's been shown many times, accurately that you would see a hierarchical representation occurring. And that you'd see later layers, so for example, figure C should relate to later R4, for example, and earlier ones to R1. The reason that I believe this does not happen, and this is something similar occurred in the research of Michaelis Werner, is that I believe the images that we used in the end were too large. Due to the size of the images, the limited number of pooling we had between the different layers, and the fact that our network was quite shallow in the end, only 4 layers deep, I think that the networks or the information present there were not forced to become non-retinotopic. So all of our layers in the end acted in a retinotopic fashion. This, of course, would make it that all of the layers would very well correlate with V1. And I think you can quite well see this, that the highest correlation is always seen in part A, so with V1, and this drops down for the other areas from B to C. So what I believe is that each of the layers is very well connected or very well correlated with V1, and why in our network, so in the all example, E1 is the highest, is actually, in my opinion, a very good sign, because E1 would be kind of what we'd expect V1 to be. And then what I think occurs is the information present in E2 and E3 are just worse versions of what is being, or less refined versions of what's occurring in E1.
Okay, so I'm going to give you an alternative interpretation. Can I?
Okay.
So I have 2 alternative interpretations to this. I mean, this is the one you wrote in your thesis, but you know, I like to find issues. One could be your model has learned both simple and complex information at the lowest level. So you know the difference between V1, V2, and V4. I mean, depending on the stimuli that you are using, may not be particularly large, but your model may have just learned too much at the lowest level. So maybe it's a problem of the fact that the architecture is such that it learns things in a non-hierarchical way. The other thing that is also possible is that the stimuli you're using for the fMRI, or you've used or have been used in this fMRI experiment, don't generate very different representations in these areas. So they are all very similar to each other. Have you thought about looking at this? And if not, how do you think you can rule out these 2 other interpretations?
So I'll take the second part first. The stimuli we're using and the data set we use is the NSD data set, which is a very famous data set being used by many researchers within the fMRI field for modeling. So I would not argue that the images, all of the images show a very different kind of objects. So I think that the stimuli or the data set is differentiable enough that the results should lead to a kind of difference in difference in level of abstraction. I don't think they're too similar to each other. With your first point, the fact that you argue that the lowest level could already build these higher level representations and low level representations, I don't believe this to be true. Firstly, because the viewpoints of each of the individual units at the lower levels are very small. So they cannot integrate information from a large area of the photo or of the images. This would imply that they cannot do kind of spatial reasoning that would be necessary to build these very higher level abstract representations. So I do not believe this to be the case. I generally, and this is also, of course, why I wrote in the thesis, I do believe it's due to the fact that we just do not have enough pooling and enough layers. So there would have to be, so that's why I kind of proposed also in the thesis that I would like to replicate the research done by Cyril Penards, Professor Penards, where he used smaller stimuli, so the CFAR10 data sets, much smaller images, and I would use the same architecture as that, and then I would test if, so he found, for example, that in lower level areas you would have edge detection, so you'd have a preference for orientation with the units, and higher levels for class of object. So I would like to replicate this kind of experiment and then test. I think that would be a viable test to see whether or not the network can form high-level abstractions or not.
Okay, I think I have 2 minutes to my clock, and so I will ask you to give a very brief answer to my follow-up question, otherwise I'm eating time from everybody else. I'm going to jump to chapter 3, And that's figure 3.6. You show the results of testing your network on both omitted stimuli and expected and unexpected stimuli. And when I look at this figure, the one thing I noticed that perhaps you haven't discussed is the fact that the response, the activation elicited by an omitted stimulus is the same, more or less in magnitude, actually very close to the one elicited by an unexpected stimulus. So the two pink bars on the top and the bottom graph, they're both basically activating a lot. And so as long as these activation magnitudes are comparable between figure A and B, this would indicate that an omitted stimulus is generating the same amount of activity than an unexpected stimulus. While this may seem appealing because you say, well, an omitted stimulus is an error, so it should be somewhat processed like that. The only real problem is that any omission-related neurophysiological study done in audition, for example, has shown that there are omission responses, but they are very small compared to, for example, driving the same neurons with their preferred stimulus. So how do you explain this behavior?
Thank you. I'll try and keep it very short. The graphs, yes, the activations in stimulus emitted and stimulus unexpected are the same magnitude, but these are normalized graphs. So the activation is not the same between them. So it could be that emitted stimuli has a much lower activation overall, but because we normalize both graphs to have it always present at 1 basically, that's why you have the difference between them. So within each of the areas, we would always normalize it to see the difference between, for each level, between presented and emitted in the top figure, and then between expected and unexpected in the bottom figure. But the magnitudes between the graphs are not per se at the same level.
Okay, yeah, this was a short answer.
Yeah, thanks for that. So the opposition will now be continued by the second member of the assessment committee, Professor Dr. Floris de Lange, who is a full professor at the Radboud University Nijmegen at the Donders Institute, where he holds a chair for perception and cognition, and he's joining us online today.
Thank you, Pro-Rector. Dear candidates, dear Ibrahim, first of all, my congratulations on this fine piece of work. I really also extend my congratulations to your supervisory team. I thought your work was important and rigorous computational work, and like my colleague, Professor De Martino already mentioned, I really appreciated the deep dive that you did into predictive coding. And finally, I also really liked how well you explained all the concepts in your thesis, making it a very nice read. So thanks for that, and very well done. Now, what I wanted to do with you is to have a bit more of a general discussion with you about how you think we should situate your work in the broader field. And more specifically, my questions relate to some of the propositions that you put forward accompanying your thesis. Now, the first proposition that you sent me last week was that of all the deep learning models inspired by hierarchical predictive coding, your one, PrediRep, currently stands out as the most viable computational representation of the theory. I really liked that proposition, and it got me thinking about the different levels of analysis that you could that you can look at a problem in neuroscience, as David Marr has also defined them. So the computational, the algorithmical, and the implementational. And to start us off, I was curious what level of analysis you think this theory of hierarchical predictive coding is living. So is it a theory that lives at the computational level, the algorithmic level, or the implementation level?
Esteemed opponent, thank you for your kind compliments and for your question. In my opinion, and I kind of think I reflected this within the thesis, I believe predictive coding or hierarchical predictive coding is very well defined at the top 2 level of Marr, so in the terms on the computational and at the algorithmic level. And I think their work has really, or is very advanced and has been very well defined. But I think at the implementation level, and this is what is kind of also a worry of mine and why our network, we made it such an abstract representation, and we also very clearly try and state this, that we do not want to make any claims on the implementation level. There are just currently too many different theories out there. Not in a negative sense, it's of course great that people are proposing different theories, but it is just not yet well defined. So nowadays have the hierarchical predictive coding implementation, but of course you also have nowadays a dendritic predictive coding implementation. So all of these different ideas that exist out there are viable potentially implementations of both the algorithm and the computational goal of that predictive coding postulates. And that's why I think on the algorithmic and on the computational goal, predictive coding is very well defined. I think very mature, but at the implementation level, there's still a lot of debate there.
Yeah, thank you. Now, I think that is an excellent answer. In a sense, yeah, I mostly agree with you. But then when we go to your third proposition, there you state that your algorithm or your computational model, Predictive, that it successfully replicates key neural phenomena of the visual cortex while closely mimicking its operational mechanisms. So there, to my mind, you are sort of making a commitment to the implementational level. So, and I was, that got me thinking whether you, how you feel about sort of the implementational level. So, how important is it, you think, that your algorithm can replicate these key neural phenomena, which arguably are sort of implementational details, or would you say that they are not implementational details that you're looking at here?
So in my opinion, I think that, and I kind of try to also argue this in the thesis, there is a valid point. For example, if dendritic predictive coding is true, what would end stopping be? Would it be that the apical dendrites of the neurons then have end stopping, whereas the somas do not? So this is of course a question where I think it's a fair point to make. Okay, I show with Predictive that it can replicate end stopping, for example, which would situate it more closely with hierarchical predictive coding, postulating that error neurons and prediction neurons are separate entities. While I think the network still, or the architecture of Predictive still can have a lot of positive impact because it is an abstract representation of the theory. Of course, in certain cases, for example, in the end stopping case, we are deciding on a kind of approach because we're arguing, okay, errors should be represented in neurons because then you could have this kind of effect of end stopping. But I think that the theory in itself can, or the network can still bring a lot of positive impact in the research field. For example, because we were able to show many of these phenomena without making a direct claim on what exactly the information is that's present there. But I do very much agree that once the implementation of predictive coding is discovered, the viability of networks such as mine might become more questionable, and one would have to see whether or not to continue working with them. But I think at the current stage, it can lead to a lot of positive developments in predictive coding because it can allow us to test many different ideas we might have or researchers might have in the field without per se going down at the implementation level, because there's of course a lot of research done also just at the algorithmic level or at the computational level of predictive coding.
So what would you advise us or the field in general to make more progress in the future? Do you think we should, for example, make the models more, give them more implementational details? So in other words, to go from the hierarchical predictive coding models and try to put more meat on the bone? Or should we do experiments and try to get different type of data that will be able to better constrain the models? Should we strive for a different level of implementational detail than we have currently? What do you think would be sort of like a fruitful way forward for the field to make traction?
I think if we want to continue with predictive coding as a theory, and we want to investigate it, and we want to discover whether the brain actually follows the rules of predictive coding, which is something I'm very passionate about and I find very interesting, I think implementation is something that we do need to get, or we need to kind of discover. However, I think that you can do two tracks of research. You can have people working on the implementation and discovering precisely how the brain could implement something like predictive coding, while at the same time I think predictive coding is a very valuable research paradigm which can be used to build experimental ideas about the brain and potentially discover things that are not per se related to predictive coding, but can still give you a viewpoint of how the brain could achieve different neural phenomena and so forth. So, because we were able to show that, for example, predictive coding, which I always find nice, in the thesis we showed that predictive coding was able to explain figure ground segmentation, which is not a phenomenon that's per se been linked too much to predictive coding. Professor Lamme has linked it more towards feedback in general. I think these kind of experiments you can do without making claims about the implementation, but you can still show that predictive coding, for example, could play a role in this one phenomenon. Or, yeah.
Yeah, okay. Thank you very much for your answer. I give the floor back to the pro-rector.
Yeah, thank you very much. So now we continue the opposition with the third member of the assessment committee, Dr. Benjamin Peters, who is a lecturer for computational cognitive science at the University of Edinburgh.
Thank you. Yeah, dear candidate, congratulations to a great thesis, I think, great talk. Also to the supervisor team, to a really great thesis and important work of modeling, in my opinion. Congratulations to the family and friends that hopefully enjoy this moment very much, and hope you're enjoying it as well. Yeah, so I think this work is very important because eventually any understanding of the brain, I believe, requires modeling. And you make appeal to Feynman's quote in your propositions that eventually we want, our understanding is proven by our ability to create basically the system or recreate the system. So I think it's very important work, and it's hard work, so it doesn't come easily to create models that are like the brain. The brain is very complex. So I'm by training a psychologist, but I want to take a little bit more of a stance of an engineering perspective here. And so the questions are a little more open-ended. And I'm asking about how could we build better predictive coding models. So I think that the one you created is faithfully implementing a theory, the hierarchical predictive coding theory, which is kind of grounded in Rao Ballard paper maybe, and is inspired also, I guess, by Lee and Mumford, less probabilistic, I guess. But so the question is are we on the right track here? So obviously you made a very important contribution, but how would our models look like in 10 years? How do we get there? And so the first question is about the training tasks you use, which in the first 2 chapters are these videos of these roof-mounted cameras on cars. And the model is trained to predict the next frame. And so my question is basically, do you think that's a good task to train these models? So in particular, if you think about it, these kind of videos, and imagine this like a frame-by-frame video, not a lot is changing on a particular location, right? It's like in many locations, it's actually pretty much the same. And then, if at all, it's small translations of things, just shifting things left to right a little bit, mostly. I think in figure 2.6 of your thesis, you also have this kind of a baseline where you correlate the current frame and the future frame, the kind of similarity. And it's pretty high already, so kind of a suggestion that the kind of frame-by-frame similarity is pretty high. So do you think the model is actually doing some kind of prediction as suggested by predictive coding, or is it doing something more trivial in that sense? Do you find evidence for predicting the camera movement, like in which direction is it going? Maybe even where cars are moving, right? So does it do this? And maybe the hardest, maybe something that is close to me is like object permanence. Does it, for instance, remember objects and predicts their disocclusions? That's the first question, and if not, what do you think would you change about the training task or the video? Like, how would you design the next big project and study?
Esteemed opponent, thank you very much for your kind compliments and your question. So I'll try and unpack, because there's different points you brought up. I'll try and unpack everything. The first point is that the data set we used and the training we used, the reason that we did this is because our network is to a certain extent similar to other networks that exist, these competitor networks such as PredNet, Pre-CNet, and these are the data sets that they used. Therefore, that's why we wanted to remain in this kind of paradigm of the same data sets, because we wanted to also really show the difference that our network achieves compared to their networks. I would not say a car driving around or videos of a car driving around are potentially the best kind of stimuli we could use. So there's very interesting new data sets. There's an Ego 3D data set, I think, which is a very large data set, which shows individuals, so humans, that have a camera on their head doing different tasks in a day-to-day life. So this would be a far more realistic video data set because it would be really what kind of we humans see on a day-to-day, so what the brain would see. So I would, if I could redo my research now, or if I could do another paper, I would take this exact data set and potentially train Predictive on this. And then I fully agree with you. So these kind of tests, such as object permanence, for example, measuring certain causes that might exist in the data set, such as the angle, the rotation and stuff, these are very important things one could test to see how well does a network actually maintain or measure these. And previously, PredNet actually showed this, so their networks were able to show this. So this would be, of course, interesting to show, okay, does PrediRep, with its close alignment to predictive coding, also encapsulate these kind of different measurements? Now, with the next frame-to-frame prediction, you're of course right that information doesn't change per se frame-to-frame. However, it's also not that in daily life things change very rapidly. So we are also in very consistent environments where things don't rapidly change. So I think that it's not per se a very, or the data sets are not, or the type of prediction task predicting the next frame is not a problem for these kind of networks, or it's not an issue or not valid to use them for training the networks. What I think would be very interesting is that you could, for example, use this kind of 3D ego data set at the frame rate at which the brain also works. And this, I think, would be a very viable data set for these kind of networks.
Yeah, that's a good interesting idea, yeah. So that kind of ties into my following question. So what else would you change potentially? So hierarchical predictive coding is a theory, right? So, and I think it's inspired by some kind of engineering ideas or like from computer science. But it's a theory of the brain, and theories, as like any models, are wrong, right? So also predictive coding is eventually wrong. So it might be also fundamentally wrong. So one maybe pointer is to say, well, we don't have models yet that work at scale and the same scale as the human brain, whereas we can do this with other kind of paradigms like classification training, right? So deep neural network models. So that might be just we haven't figured out yet how to train like really deep hierarchical predictive coding models. The architecture, the hardware might be different between brain and computers, or there might be some deeper issues with predictive coding. So, so what's the hardest thing about predictive coding to implement? Like, what's the thing that makes it hard to train, for instance? Or do you think like that seems like when you want to build a system that sees the world and learns unsupervised, is that actually like a good idea? What are there parts that you think could be getting rid of? Things you want to introduce, like in machine learning, that it's something like quantization or contrastive predictive coding. So there's different ideas. Do you have any idea how you would kind of build a better visual system?
Yes. So I think that you make a very valid point, right? These computation models are all very limited. And I think one of the key limitations, which I kind of realized doing my research, was that when we build these computational models of the visual system, we maintain them only in the visual system, right? So the only input they receive is kind of these images, and there's no task that the network has to do that we as humans have to do, right? We have to survive, we have to interact. There's no embodiment of the networks in the kind of body, quote unquote, that I can actually fulfill objectives. So what I think would be very interesting is to use a network such as Predictive, but to integrate it into a larger scale architecture, which actually, for example, with reinforcement learning, is attempting to fulfill some kind of task. And then I believe that these kind of networks will get much better because the information that they have to process, the level of abstraction, I think, will be much better because they actually need to take information that is present within the visual system and use it for something else. And that's, of course, what we as humans do. We don't just predict, but we act as well. And I think, therefore, I think something like embodiment of the network in a larger structure would be a very valuable or valid way to go forward.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. So we continue the opposition with the fourth member of the assessment committee, Dr. Judith Peters, again here from Maastricht. She's associate professor at the Cognitive Neuroscience department.
Dear candidate, I want to join the others with congratulating you with this impressive thesis, and I also want to extend the congratulations to your supervisory team and to your friends and family. And I enjoyed reading your thesis a lot, and I was especially impressed by all the implementations of the different models that you did. I can imagine that must have been a lot of work, especially at the start of your PhD when PyTorch and TensorFlow were not that advanced yet. So I applaud you for doing this. But your thesis also raised some questions, and especially the choice that you have for your learning rule. Because you stressed several times how important it is to have biological relevant models, but there are also some more learning rules that are more biological valid. And I do understand the reasons why you chose backpropagation through time, but I was wondering whether you can speculate on whether you could have used a more biological realistic learning rule and whether this would improve or hamper the performance of your model.
Esteemed opponent, thank you for your compliments and your question. So of course, backprop through time is typically considered a not very biological learning rule. And there are approaches currently existing in the field. For example, Professor Penart's built his deep-gated Hebbian learning network, so he uses Hebbian learning compared to the learning rule we used, which is more biologically valid. And I think it's very interesting to see how his research develops and how this model can compare to other models. The issue is, it depends on what you're trying to model. So a lot of these networks that use more biological learning rules, also, for example, Professor Penart's, have to use very simple stimuli. So they cannot be trained with very complex, very ecologically valid stimuli. And deep learning, just by virtue of chance maybe, or I don't know, just is a learning rule that allows these computational models to do tasks that are very lifelike. For example, to classify or to predict very complex stimuli with a lot of movement. And therefore, while I agree that the learning rule in itself is not very biologically plausible, I think if you want to, depending on what you want to measure, if you want to model more lifelike interactions, functionality, you need to currently use these kind of learning rules. I also want to stress that we did not implicitly model the learning itself. So yes, while we used this kind of learning rule to create our models, we then tested the model at the later stage when it actually had its functionality working. So we did not make claims about whether the learning was biological or not. But I think it's a very valid question, and I think there's research out there which I think, like I'm watching with curiosity on how it'll develop.
Thanks, yeah. And it actually brings me to a follow-up question, because you hinted yourself already to reinforcement learning, and I was wondering whether this is possible at all. You train, again, yeah, for the reasons that you just mentioned, you train your model with backpropagation, but then during the testing of the model, you do an additional training with the reinforcement learning. Is this something that is possible at all to do, or is this, right, I don't know the answer.
No, of course. No, so I would do it at the same time. So I'd build a model that can do the reinforcement learning with a task, and then this is how the network would train. So I wouldn't do first a training with backprop and then followed up by reinforcement learning within a kind of structure, but I'll train it at the same time. And then you do use backprop through it.
Okay, yeah. And during the training, how would you envision then the implementation of reinforcement learning?
So I would, for example, I could imagine that you have you could have, just coming out of the top of my mind, I spent a lot of time with a researcher who models hand movements with a cube. So you could have a visual system that's looking at the cube, and that's therefore always predicting what it will see next, right? So that would be kind of the visual part. And the hand has to achieve a certain number of movements to create a certain letter in its hand, right? It knows where it is and it has to move it in the minimum number of steps. This could be a task you could use with reinforcement learning, but you just force the visual part of the brain to follow the rules of predictive coding, and then you can see what occurs by imparting things like predictions and error, and exactly like Predictive as we used it, could be used then.
Okay, thanks, yeah. I think I still have some more time, and I had a second thought about how you could implement more biological, realistic features in your model, and that's we humans fortunately have a bit of a trace of memory in the visual cortex, right? So there is this lingering trace that we can use, for example, if you blink with our eyes, to have this continuity kind of perception. And I was wondering, there's at the moment no memory in your model. Is there an option to implement such memory? And If so, how would you implement this?
So in the terms of so what you're kind of hinting towards, I think, are after images, right? The idea that you look at something, you close your eyes, and then you still see it.
I'm more thinking about iconic memory, but
iconic memory, okay. No, so very fair. Currently, our network doesn't contain the ability to have memory, so there's not something that we imparted within the network. You could have things where, for example, you have certain. So I'm not an expert in this, but I would try and kind of hypothesize. You have things such as conv LSTMs, which are units, which are deep learning networks, units which have a kind of longer-term memory. They are, and they could then be used to maintain memory within the visual system. But then there are reasons why you would not use conv LSTMs, which is also what I argued in the thesis, that they're not, or that they take away a lot of the computational ability of the networks. So I think it's a very interesting question, and I think you could create memory within the system. I think it would be very important to use it. But the current kind of theory that I'm trying to replicate with hierarchical predictive coding, of course, doesn't contain memory in itself as part of the approach. And therefore, that's why we did not look at it. And that's why I would not want to make too strong a hypothesis of how to actually include it.
Yeah. Although, of course, predictive coding for predicting the next frame is in itself using a bit the
Yes, so that's of course very true. Like the network does maintain a kind of overview, and this is of course encoded within we have a recurrence within the network, which does encode a kind of form of memory. And when you show these networks, for example, an image, and then you let the network not see anything, it would still see this image for a while. So this is something that actually occurs within these networks. Yeah, that's very true. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, thanks. I give the word back to the prorector.
Yeah, thank you very much all for keeping on time. So the opposition will now be concluded by last but not least, Professor Dr. Bernard Jansma, Chair in Cognitive Neuroscience of Language, likewise here from Maastricht University.
Thanks, Prorector, dear candidate. First of all, also from my side, very much congratulations to your great work. Also to the supervisor teams and the family, of course. I enjoyed reading it a lot, and I especially liked your intro on the book of Optics by Al-Haytham, who wrote the book already in 1000 AD, which approximately is the time where they here started to build the cathedral of the Unsere Liebe Frau, right? So, and I think probably we were still fighting for the heights of towers in Protestant and Catholic churches. Some cultures already were very advanced in how the visual system would work. So, and I liked it that you showed that multicultural research field also in the introduction. Thanks a lot. I relate a bit to chapter 2, and especially the way you trained the model, which I loved because it's, well, you just said you don't like the road traffic videos too much, but I think they are better than single pictures because we never look at single pictures all the time, so I think it's more ecologically valid. But you trained basically a model using the German driver video clips Kitty, and you tested the model, and you also then trained on an American California data set, and that triggered me now taking me as the Kitty system. I was trained in the German highway system. I think I drive well, so my model performance is okay. Once I cross the border to the Netherlands, it's already problematic, so the loss function actually might result in a huge error because I'm speeding, and it's even more severe when I go to California, and that's actually a real-life experience. So with that in mind, I looked into your figure 2.2. I don't know the page, but and there you actually displayed the results of your model. Let's see which page it is.
24.
There. And I just focus on panel A, where you have the 4 models on MSE Kitty, and you have the panel C, where you see the performance on the American data set. So on average, the pattern is similar, so I follow your argumentation there. But when I look into the scale, it seems that the model does better on the American data set. That's at odd to me. Could you explain that to me?
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you for your compliment and thank you for your question. So, what we did is we trained our data set or our networks on the Kitty data set, and then we tested them both on Kitty and Caltech. And you're right that the values for the Caltech data set seem to be better because the MSE is lower, which is a good sign. The reason is very simple. The Caltech data set has a camera at a different position where a large section of the camera is covered by a car. So a large section of the image is actually just a solid color. And that's why the general difference is much easier to predict because a large section of it will not change. And that's why in Caltech it's just lower. Okay. It's just a stimulus thing.
And that also explains the similarity index, which is the reverse and actually also at odd. Like that's the panel B and D in the same figure.
Yeah, exactly. And that explains why for Kitty you have a higher, or for Caltech the SSIM, which is a measure which is kind of similar to how humans would perceive it. That's what they argue. That's why it's higher there as well. Okay.
So, and did you mention that in the discussion somewhere? Because I missed that.
We did discuss the differences between the data sets, but it's the aim was not to. The aim of the showing these results was not to argue whether they're better at one or the other data set. The aim was to just show that our network, while trained with one data set, doesn't theoretically overfit only on this data set, but actually learns something higher than that, and therefore still functions also on other data sets that are different. Yeah. But it's a very valid point and potentially something that should be explicitly mentioned on why the results are different.
That makes sense. Thanks a lot. And that brings me to another point, and it's a very general question on the sense of this hierarchical predictive coding theory. Because, so a simple question would be, what if I cannot predict? Will I also not see?
Theoretically, if you cannot predict, so you'd send an empty prediction, you would see because you'd see the entire error signal that would be sent through to your brain because you wouldn't be predicting anything away.
Yeah,
so
but
theoretically, no.
So I then, yeah, but why would I get an error signal then if I can't predict? Because then actually there is no computation possible between the actual input and what I predict. Because prediction would be zero.
Prediction, so the way that you can imagine it, this I think you get a bit to the implementation level. So I can maybe talk about it on an architecture level, so in the network itself. If you would make no prediction, you would make a prediction of zeros. And this would be compared then to your input, which would be a full image. And therefore the error would be the inverse of the image, and you'd see the entire inverse of the image. In the brain, theoretically, predictions are seen as a form of inhibition. And therefore, if you would have no inhibition, the signal that's entering your eyes would also be fully passed through because there would be no inhibition of the signal entering.
Okay, so I get that. That's a nice explanation, thanks. And then I would like to continue by, I assume that you see this as an adult-like brain, so all is ready and ready to roll. But of course, from a psychological developmental point of view, we know that prediction also evolve over time. So we learned that in our course on the forward model. There was this famous example when you see a toddler trying to catch a ball, the toddler will not manage, will always move the hand too late because you need to learn to predict the trajectory of the ball. And once you have that, after thousands of training trials, you manage. So how would you envision to study the development of prediction in perception? So would it be possible, for example, to look into the learning characteristics of your model over time and see it as a toddler, like a puber adult,
so
adolescent?
You could definitely do this. So what we do, of course, with the network is we train it over 150 epochs, we call it, which are 150 cycles of the data set. You could, at different stages, stop training the network and then test how it performs. I would assume it would just show a lot more error because it would be a lot less familiar with the environment and therefore be less good at predicting. But you could definitely do these with these kind of networks, is that you could stop the training at different cycles and then have less or more developed versions of your network.
Yeah, that's nice because they also mentioned this object permanence, we know that some kids don't have that at the time, and when the object is gone or occluded, it's not there anymore. And at one point, kids can do that, so one could actually look into that, right?
Yes, it would be very interesting to test what kind of effects or things are learned at different cycles of the learning process. I think it's a very interesting research question to look at.
Yeah, that's nice. And I have another, probably also related to implementation, because of course you have the error units in your model. That seems to be working well, according to your conclusion, but sort of it seems very computational complex. And we have next to like believing or not in prediction, we also have some idea that whatever the brain does, it computes in the most like parsimonious way eventually. Mm-hmm. So how would you envision the brain actually implements these error neurons? Yeah.
This is a very good question. So, of course, the theory that you'd have error neurons is less parsimonious. There are other approaches. So dendritic predictive coding postulates that you don't have a separate prediction and error neuron, but you have a single neuron where you have in the soma, you have the kind of prediction present, and in the apical dendrite, you have the error present. So this would be a more parsimonious way of achieving still the same theory with less amount of units.
Yeah, and how would you, but then for me, the dendrites are more like the weights in your setup, so then you would not need a specific extra level of error units, but you can incorporate it into the weight pattern of your model eventually?
I would argue that the weights represent axons in the network, so not per se the dendrites. I think in the network you'd still have to have the separation at an algorithmic level. Even though at the implementation level, it might be within a single unit. So I would argue, no, you'd still have to maintain the two types of signals or two types of units.
Okay, fair enough. Yeah, and I think I have many more. If you like, you can, everyone. So also related to colleagues' remarks on what else can we do in the future. So we not only learn because of nothing, but we mostly also learn based on reward. The entire idea of having loss functions actually come from economy, right? Mm-hmm. So in terms of what to do. So how would you incorporate reward into perceptual learning?
Can I finish? Can I try not, or is it not allowed? No, sorry.
Very briefly.
No.
No, you cannot.
We can talk about it in the research.
So Ibrahim Hashim, the time appointed for defending your thesis has passed. The degree committee will now withdraw to discuss the quality of your thesis and your defense. And I request that you and your company shall remain here in this room until we return from our deliberations.
Thanks.
Thank you.
The PhD defense has now ended. The degree committee will debate the candidate's performance behind closed doors. This process usually takes about 10 minutes.
Long road to the south side. 7 miles in my rearview mirror, I know what it felt like. My goals only getting clearer, east side to the west side. No place like home, if it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and die. All your time, 'cause I'll go the extra mile. Long road to the south side, 7 miles in my rearview mirror, I know what it felt like. My goal's only getting clearer. East side to the west side. No place like home. If it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and not. On the dash, got my laces tied. Long road, I don't waste no time. Break rules because fate decides. With the team and we chase the light. I make a move, fall down, shake it off. I hate to lose, bad branch, break it off. No room for negativity, praise and love. Prepare for deep part cause we're taking off. Hit the mileage, traveling so far from home. Gathering knowledge, other connections. I put the time in to get everything I ever hoped for. It's a challenge and we all in. It's a better future that we go for. And even though these nights seem long, I know that I am never on my own. Know you won the battle once you've grown. South side, 10 miles in my rearview mirror. I know what it felt like. My goal's only getting clearer. East side to the west side. No place like home. If it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and not. Long road to the south side, 10 miles in my rearview mirror. I know what it felt like. My goal's only getting clearer. East side to the west side. No place like home. If it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and not. Years can't fly by now, don't waste all your time. Cause I'll go the extra mile.
Ibrahim Hashim, the degree committee here present has assessed the quality of your thesis and your defense. In view of its positive verdict and taking into account your previous qualifications, the committee has decided to grant you the degree of doctor. And Professor Goebel is now authorized to confer upon you this academic distinction in accordance with Dutch university custom. And I invite your supervisor to now take the floor.
Thank you.
Do you promise to work in accordance with the principles of scientific integrity at all times, to be careful and honest, transparent, independent and responsible?
I promise.
By the authority vested in us by law and in conformity with the decision of the committee here present, I hereby confer upon you, Ibrahim J. Hashim, the degree of doctor, and grant you all rights attached by custom and law. As evidence of this, I now present you with the degree certificate signed by the rector, the secretary, and the other members of the committee, and affixed with the official seal of the university.
Safe. Congratulations.
Thank you so much.
Congratulations, Ibrahim. You did a wonderful performance, and I want to extend this congratulation to your friends and especially family. But I give the honor to present the laudatio to your daily supervisor, Mario Senden.
Thank you, Rainer. Well, dear colleagues, friends, and family of Ibrahim, we are here now to celebrate his successful PhD defense. And I would like to say a few words about him. So when I first met Ibrahim, he already had quite an interesting academic journey behind him. So he began at the University College Maastricht, which has a bit of a more self-directed curriculum. And he originally actually went more into a chemistry direction, right? Eventually, though, he pivoted towards neuroscience. Initially, this was not actually because the brain is obviously the most interesting thing you could study in this world, but you were a little bit disappointed in actually the program that was related to chemistry and the teaching that was going on there. Well, we're very happy that you made this pivot. And of course, in the end, you did actually get very deeply interested in how the mind works and how the mind actually, well, in a way, creates the world around it. So of course that doesn't mean you went towards solipsism, you actually went towards predictive coding and to decide to do then also a research master in cognitive neuroscience. And interestingly, that brought you first from Maastricht to Glasgow, where you did an internship, and then you came back to Maastricht to do your PhD, which is kind of interesting given that actually any conversation you have you bring up how you would like some warmer climate, and then you go from cold country to cold country. That's okay. I wouldn't have predicted that, but anyway. So the climate might have been a bit more cold, but of course with you, the atmosphere was always warm, and debates occasionally can get quite heated, right? So those who know Ibrahim know that his wit is sharp, and sometimes sharply sarcastic. and his convictions are unwavering. And he has a very genuine passion for social, political, and ethical questions, and I think your second name really speaks to that as well. But this is also part what makes you a very compelling person, in my opinion. And I really have to say that to me, you are a true philosopher-scientist and a real Renaissance man. So in your research, you draw inspiration from really classical insights like Ibn al-Haytham and Helmholtz, and you manage to combine your cutting-edge computational work with deep philosophical questions on the essence of perception and knowledge. And not everybody can do that. Beyond your academic qualities, you have also demonstrated a really remarkable talent for diplomacy. Though it is very uncommon in Maastricht to encounter any serious clashes with colleagues, you were a little bit unfortunate that you were confronted with such a challenge. And I don't want to go into any details, but you really impressed me with how you managed to resolve the situation through your calm engagement. I really learned something from you in that. Now you are returning to Germany, this time to focus more on ethical implications of AI as an AI educator. And I suspect you will still find yourself daydreaming about warmer weather. And I can only hope that your path eventually will lead you there, though maybe not to the extent that what you have told me in the past, you had to dash between air-conditioned space to air-conditioned space, so maybe not that amount of hot weather. So in the meantime, you will take with you your sharp intellect and your caring nature, and those are qualities that will serve you whatever you will do in life. So Ibrahim, your family, your friends, once more, congratulations on this extraordinary achievement. Your path has spanned many disciplines, and it has enriched science in our community here in Maastricht. We are all incredibly proud of you, and also a little bit sad that you have to leave us, and we will very much miss you. So congratulations, Dr. Ibrahim Che Hashim.
Thank you very much.
Dear Dr. Hashim, also on behalf of Maastricht University, I would like to congratulate you on achieving this degree of doctor here today, and I extend these congratulations to your supervisors and of course your family who supported you and your friends along the way. On a practical note, there will now be a reception afterwards to celebrate, and I hereby close this academic ceremony.